Chapter 3: Political Economy and the Rise of the Capitalist State. Adam Smith and the Crisis of Mercantilism. Smith was right in thinking that his work would have little popular appeal. Popular opposition to the corruption of the state, to the abuse of power, and above all to the burden of taxation was expressed in the voice of democratic political theory without needing any sophisticated economic theory to articulate its grievances. Moreover, Smith had considerably overestimated the extent to which the system of mercantilism presented a barrier to the development of capitalism. The stagnation of foreign trade between 1750 and 1780 did not seriously inhibit economic growth, as domestic sources of expansion were mobilized, with more rapid agricultural improvement, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and the development of domestic financial institutions in the form of country banks. The panoply of domestic protective regulations that Smith saw as such a formidable barrier to the freedom of capital and labor simply dissolved in the face of capitalist development, despite the resistance of the working class, sometimes supported by sympathetic magistrates, while the poor law proved an invaluable complement to the militia in maintaining order as the working class suffered the costs of industrial and agricultural revolution. In the last 2 decades of the 18th century, outlets for the increasing production of capitalist industry and agriculture were found, not so much in domestic as in foreign markets, taking advantage of the commercial supremacy that was the legacy of mercantilism. The appeal of the wealth of nations was not so much to the forces struggling against the parasitic and corrupt state, as to the state itself. Ironically, the book was published in 1776, the year in which the American Revolution removed the linchpin of the colonial system. The cost of the American War provoked escalating popular opposition that drew increasingly radical inspiration from the democratic principles of the rebels. The final discrediting of the doctrines of mercantilism and the humiliation of the state with the defeat in America precipitated an ideological crisis. Smith's new system provided a means of resolving the crisis. The loss of the American colonies could immediately be reinterpreted on the basis of Smith's theory as a liberation from the burden of colonial responsibility, opening up new possibilities of increasing trade by liberalization rather than control. The critique of the colonial system could even be used to justify the French wars in the name of opening up markets to the freedom of trade. The reduction of prohibitive duties could increase revenues by stimulating the growth of trade and discouraging smuggling. The discrediting of the colonial system, the eclectic pragmatism of Smith's work, and his endorsement of the existing Constitution made it easy for the principles of the wealth of nations to become established as the new political orthodoxy, and to provide a theoretical basis for the program of, quote, economical reform, end quote, that responded to the popular protest against the burden of taxation and the corruption of the state. The enormous expansion of trade in the wake of American independence, with exports increasing 5-fold, and the financial and political success of economical reform enhanced the prestige of Smith's principles. From the late 1780s, these principles came to be accepted by government as the basis on which to determine the fiscal, commercial, and financial policies of the state, although they were always to be tempered in their application by pragmatic consideration of the circumstances. The espousal of the principles of free trade and economical government did not prevent the state from continuing to protect domestic industry and agriculture, or from using the military, political, and financial power of the state to secure commercial domination for the benefit of a wider range of capitalist interests. The East and the West Indian colonies retained their importance as resources of supply and colonial plunder, and there were few demands for their liberation. There was little opposition from capitalists to the long drawn-out and very costly French wars at the turn of the century, which set the seal on British commercial supremacy for almost a century. Similarly, There was no resistance to the use of the political and military power of the state to maintain commercial domination in North America, and later in support of the displacement of Spanish by British interests in Latin America. Tariff protection assisted the early development of important new industries. Even when the introduction of more advanced methods of production made tariff barriers anachronistic, they were maintained for revenue purposes, and despite limited liberalization, there were few demands for their removal before the second quarter of the 19th century. Economical reform and savage repression, supported by patriotic and religious chauvinism, secured the financial and political stabilization of the state during the French Wars. Although lip service was paid to Smith's principles, they had little practical impact. It was the problems created by the French Wars, and particularly the problems of post-war Reconstruction, that led to the adoption of a more radical anti-state ideology of laissez-faire. But, again, this ideology was not pressed by the capitalist class, but was adopted enthusiastically by the Tory governments of Lord Liverpool. The Napoleonic Wars provided an enormous stimulus to capitalist development. Wartime demand gave a great boost to the growth of domestic production, and the Continental blockade led to the opening up of new export markets. Agriculture, too, expanded rapidly during the war, particularly by increasing the area under cultivation. The enormous borrowing of the state to meet the needs of war stimulated the growth of banking and financial institutions. The ending of the war created acute difficulties. Agricultural overproduction had already appeared with the collapse of prices in 1813, and agriculture remained in depression for another 20 years. The loss of military contracts hit several industries, while inflation had weakened the competitive advantage of exporters. The financial instability associated with the enormous increase in the government debt and the suspension of the convertibility in 1797 was a barrier to the growth of trade. Bouts of depression in 1816, 1819, and 1826 led to widespread distress and to increasingly menacing rural and urban unrest, which found allies among the more conservative elements of the ruling class, who saw distress and disorder as the inevitable consequence of the breakdown of the traditional society with the unfettered advance of capital. The immediate response of the state to these problems was essentially conservative. Agricultural depression was to be alleviated by the strengthening of the Corn Laws, which protected domestic agriculture from foreign competition. Disorder was met by severe repression, while the distress that fueled disorder was alleviated by the Poor Law. The regulation of the monetary system was left to the bankers. Overall, the state assumed little responsibility for economic management beyond its traditional role of securing British commercial supremacy. Such an attitude of disengagement could not last for long. The Corn Laws were ineffective in supporting an agriculture whose problems derived from domestic overproduction as much as from foreign competition. Depression, distress, and disorder led to pressure for government action. The cost of the Poor Law meant a steady rise in the parish rates, on top of the increased burden of taxation required to meet government's current expenditure and the servicing of its debt. Moreover, the program of economical reform had reduced the scope for ministerial patronage, while the growth of the press and of organized public opinion brought popular pressure to bear on the government, to which the latter had increasingly to respond. The government was also under financial pressure. Monetary instability fueled financial speculation, creating difficulties for the financing of the government debt, Monetary instability fueled financial speculation, creating difficulties for the financing of the government debt, while political resistance prevented the government from increasing levels of taxation. It soon became clear that the political and financial stability of the government could only be secured by the more active intervention of the state to secure the conditions for the sustained growth of prosperity. It was in this context that political economy took up the challenge, going beyond Smith's critique of the commercial system to develop a theory within which the appropriate role of the state in the regulation of the economy could be considered. The leading role in both theoretical analysis and political debate was played by Ricardo until his death in 1823. Classical political economy. Political economy built on the foundations that Smith laid down. The inconsistencies of Smith's analysis left a large gap between his fundamental assumptions and his conclusions, while his eclecticism provided scope for a wide range of interpretations that allowed disparate schools of thought to claim Smith as their ancestor. Smith's analysis of the quantity of money was undeveloped. His theory of wages was thin. His theories of profit and rent an eclectic mixture of physiocratic and mercantilist elements, and his theory of value incoherent. It was largely in these areas that classical political economy fleshed out Smith's account. However, these developments served only to reinforce Smith's conclusions about the proper relation between money and the state. Whereas Smith applied his theory to the critique of mercantilism, political economy had the more positive aim of establishing the adequate form of liberal capitalist state. The unifying framework of classical political economy was a view of the economy as a system of production, with exchange coordinating the division of labor by regulating the allocation of labor and capital among the various branches of production, and distributing the product amongst the various social classes in the form of revenue. The normal, or quote, natural price of the product was determined by its normal cost of production, whether that be expressed in terms of labor time as for Ricardo or as the sum of wages, rent, and profit as for most of the rest of the school. Quote, market prices were determined by demand and supply. However, demand and supply were not independent of one another, hence consumption was seen primarily as a phase in the reproduction of the system of production. The regulation of the system of production was achieved by money, which, following Smith, was seen as the means of circulation. The role of money in permitting the fluctuation of market prices around the natural price was to adjust the allocation of labor and capital among the various branches of production in accordance with the needs of the physical reproduction of the system as a whole. On the whole, it was presumed that these adjustments would proceed smoothly and rapidly, so the laws of classical political economy were developed for an economy in equilibrium, in which market prices corresponded to natural prices. To the extent that there were barriers to the free mobility of the factors of production, and so to the response of production to changing prices, such adjustments might be delayed, and particular branches of production or particular employments might suffer more or less prolonged distress. However, such distress was not the result of monetary dislocation, but of the existence of real barriers to adjustment. The possibility of general overproduction was excluded by, quote, Say's law, which followed immediately from the conclusion that the money economy worked just like a barter economy. J.B. Say drew out the implications of Smith's assertion that, quote, consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, end quote. So that, quote, it is not for its own sake that men desire money, but for the sake of what they can purchase with it, end quote. Say's, quote, law of markets ensured the impossibility of general overproduction since, quote, a product is no sooner created than it, from that instant, affords a market for other products to the full extent of its own value, end quote. Say. The consequence was that distress and unemployment could only be temporary problems associated with the structural readjustment of production to changing market conditions. This led Malthus and Ricardo to resist demands for relief of distress by the poor law, the expansion of credit or public works, which would only remove the incentive for capital and labor to seek out new opportunities for profitable employment, and so prolong the necessarily painful process of adjustment. The theory of interest was developed to give substance to Say's law. The rigorous distinction between money and capital meant that the rate of interest was seen as the price of capital, not the price of money. The role of the rate of interest came to be seen as that of equating savings and investment. The withdrawal of money from circulation corresponded to an increased desire to save. The role of the rate of interest came to be seen as that of equating savings and investment. The withdrawal of money from circulation corresponded to an increased desire to save, which would be accommodated by a decline in the rate of interest that would give a stimulus to investment, so ensuring that the money thrown back into circulation as investment always corresponded to the money withdrawn from circulation as savings. An expansion of the supply of money by expanding the note issue was seen as having at most a temporary impact on the rate of interest, which would be neutralized as soon as prices had risen to absorb the increased supply of money. Thus, the monetary authorities could not affect the level of economic activity by intervening in the money markets to regulate the rate of interest. Demands for cheap credit, which came from distressed farmers and manufacturers, would merely stimulate inflation, while removing the pressure to redirect labor and capital to more profitable branches of production. Thus, the monetary authorities should resist such pressures and regulate the currency strictly in accordance with the metallic base. Say first integrated Smith's account of labor, land, and capital as the sources of the three forms of revenue into the model of exchange. Labor, land, and capital as the sources of the three forms of revenue into the model of exchange. Although Smith saw wages as deriving from the sale of labor, profit, and rent, did not derive from the sale of any particular commodity. Although Smith saw wages as deriving from the sale of labor, profit and rent did not derive from the sale of any particular commodity. Profit was some kind of markup that corresponded to a vaguely defined net product, while rent was pure surplus. Say integrated profit and rent into the model of exchange by developing the idea that they corresponded to the contributions of the productive services of capital and labor, capital and land. Although economists had some difficulty identifying precisely what were those contributions. Correspondingly, Say proposed a, quote, adding up theory of value, which defined the value of a commodity as the sum of wages, rent, and profit that comprised its cost of production. Say's model was very congenial in reducing the determination of these revenues to the common basis of the equality of exchange and dispelling the uncomfortable connotation of the idea of such revenues as comprising a surplus. However, such ideological considerations did not have great significance until the legitimacy of profits and rent came under serious challenge in the 1820s. Thus, Ricardo could develop his labor theory of value that saw profit as a form of surplus labor and rent as a deduction from profit, without imagining for one moment that his theory could be used to undermine the sanctity of private property. However, it was undoubtedly these ideological implications, rather than its technical deficiencies, that lay behind the rapid abandonment of the labor theory of value in favor of the cost of production theory in the 1830s, although many still held to the inverse relation between wages and profits that Ricardo's theory implied. Malthus's theory of population established a theoretical foundation for Smith's account of wages. High wages encouraged early marriage and lower infant mortality, so that population increased, low wages conversely inducing a decline in the rate of growth of population. In this way, the free market would ensure that, in the long run, wages would fluctuate around the subsistence minimum. The law of population came to be complemented in the short run by the, quote, wages fund doctrine, according to which the means of subsistence available to sustain the working class was fixed. Competition between the workers would ensure the equalization of wages within the limit set by the wages fund, although the existence of, quote, non-competing groups could lead to the persistence of wage differentials. The law of population implied that any measures that sought to increase wages at the expense of rent or profits would simply lead to an increase in the population until wages were reduced to the subsistence minimum. This argument was used against the Speen-Hamlin system of subsidizing wages, which was an archetypal example of a well-intentioned policy achieving the opposite of the desired effect. Quote, the clear and direct tendency of the poor laws is not, as the legislature benevolently intended, to amend the condition of the poor, but to... Hey, how's it going? but to deteriorate the conditions of both poor and rich. Instead of making the poor rich, they are calculated to make the rich poor." End quote. The same argument was also used against the egalitarian schemes of cooperators and socialists. Redistribution would lead to equality, but only to an equality of misery. The only solution to the problem of the overpopulation was that the cause of low wages was the encouragement of moral restraint on the part of the working class and the sponsorship of colonial emigration. Classical political economy largely retained Smith's assumptions and hardly modified his essential conclusions. Money was the adequate means of regulation of the capitalist system of production. Although inequality was a conspicuous feature of capitalist society, the laws of political economy established that the condition of the working class could not be improved by collective intervention, but only by moral restraint, prudence, sobriety, and self-improvement, and by the growth of capital. Distress was a temporary problem arising from the normal processes of market adjustment, the relief of which would impede the operation of the market and so intensify the problem. Cyclical fluctuations in the overall level of economic activity were the result of, quote, overtrading, stimulated by unwarranted monetary expansion. Ricardo had such faith in the smooth working of the capitalist system as to regard the laws of political economy as immutable natural laws that immediately dictated policy. However, such a doctrinaire approach soon proved inadequate to the political task that confronted the state. The failure of currency stabilization and trade liberalization to solve the post-war problems threatened to discredit political economy. Thus, the second generation of political economists tended to take a much more pragmatic view of their task, recognizing that the gap between the science of political economy and the art of statesmanship had to be bridged by political judgment. This political economy allied itself with the utilitarianism in offering a program. Thus, political economy allied itself with utilitarianism in offering a program for the reconstruction of the state that combined principle with pragmatism. Over the first half of the 19th century, political economy developed from the theory that sought to limit the powers of the state into the theory that guided the rationalization of the inherited state apparatus to create the state form appropriate to the rule of capital. Ricardo and the problems of post-war reconstruction. The problems of post-war reconstruction focused attention on three areas: currency reform, free trade, and the regulation of the working class. On a fourth area, the need to cut taxation, the national debt, and government expenditure, there was general agreement, although it was easier said than done. These issues dominated the debates around the role of the state in the regulation of the economy for the following 3 decades. Political economy provided a coherent theoretical framework within which to determine policy in all these areas, and in the end, it was the prescriptions of political economy that prevailed. Although the theory of political economy was based on an identification of the interest of capital, and particularly of productive capital, that the national interest, its triumph, was only indirectly related to the political advance of the bourgeoisie. And time after time, capitalists themselves showed little enthusiasm for the nostrums offered by the exponents of the dismal science. Although members of Parliament were at times persuaded by the eloquence and self-confidence of the political economists, they too usually had more parochial concerns. The appeal of political economy was above all to governed ministers, and later to their civil servants, for whom political economy offered a universalistic ideology that corresponded to their own pretension to stand above contending particular interest in pursuit of the general good. The issue of currency reform centered on the responsibility of the Bank of England for the issue of paper currency. The Bullion Report of 1810 had blamed the wartime inflation on the overissue of inconvertible notes by the Bank of England and recommended the immediate restoration of convertibility. However, the bank had vigorously defended its policies on the grounds of Smith's real bills doctrine that overissue was impossible so long as the money supply was only increased by discounting sound commercial bills. Inflation was attributed to pressures in the real economy, the bank merely accommodating these pressures by meeting the legitimate demands of commerce. The opponents of the bank noted that in accommodating inflation, by expanding credit, the bank further fueled the inflationary pressures. If the bank pursued a competitive discount policy and so pushed the rate of interest below the normal rate of profit, there would be no limit to the demand for money, and so to the extent of inflation and overissue. The only solution was to restore the convertibility of the currency so that inflationary pressures would be limited by the limited supply of money, a drain on the reserves of the Bank of England, forcing it to restrict credit and so limit the extent of overtrading. Although wartime inflation had provided a powerful stimulus to the prosperity of agricultural and industrial capitalists, and monetary instability and heavy government borrowing had provided large profits for financial speculators, there was general agreement on the need to restore the stability of the currency by reestablishing convertibility. The main opposition to the return to gold derived from Birmingham, where manufacturers, hit hard by the loss of wartime contracts, agitated for policies such as the free expansion of credit, public expenditure to relieve distress, and even public works to absorb unemployment. Birmingham, whose spokesman was the banker Thomas Atwood, continued to be the main source of opposition to monetary orthodoxy for the next 3 decades. The main problem preventing the restoration of convertibility was that the currency was overvalued as a result of wartime inflation, and so the restoration of convertibility at the old parity could only be accomplished after a period of deflation. The bankers' belief that inflation was not a monetary phenomenon, but had real causes, such as exceptional government expenditure, bad harvests, and war, implied that the restoration of normality would see prices returning to their normal level, at which point convertibility could be painlessly restored. On the other hand, it was widely believed that any attempt to restrict credit so as to force down prices and achieve the premature restoration of convertibility would reduce not only prices, but also income and employment, and would provoke severe distress. In 1810, this consideration persuaded Parliament to reject the Bullion Report, although the expectation was that convertibility would be re-established soon after the end of the war as prices returned to their normal level. Ricardo was the main voice raised against the fears of deflation. Ricardo took up Hume's theory of the specie flow mechanism to show that convertibility was a sufficient condition for maintaining both the stability of the currency and the balance of international payments as domestic prices rose and fell to preserve the international competitiveness of domestic producers. Ricardo believed that the overissue of the currency was the only cause of an outflow of gold, and that the contraction of the issue would restore equilibrium by the reduction of prices smoothly and painlessly. Ricardo followed Smith in favoring the replacement of gold in circulation by a paper currency, but insisted Ricardo followed Smith in favoring the replacement of gold in circulation by a paper currency, but insisted that the paper currency's issue should be strictly regulated according to the state of the exchanges, so that the paper currency's circulation would correspond exactly to that of a metallic currency. Ricardo's simplistic optimism, born of his stockbroker's faith in the smoothness of market adjustment, was not widely shared. Deflation was almost universally rejected, not least for fear of provoking further popular unrest by giving the Depression an added twist. Even capitalists in the export trades, who could expect to benefit from lower prices and monetary stability, were very apprehensive of the short-term effects of deflation and currency appreciation. Those farmers and manufacturers producing for the domestic market, who were often burdened with debt and who had already been hard hit by the post-war depression, were the most strongly opposed to deflation. Thus, the restoration of convertibility was repeatedly postponed, until falling prices and currency appreciation with the ending of the boom in 1819 brought the issue to a head. Peel's bill of 1819 proposed the gradual restoration of convertibility over a period of 4 years. However, the fear of deflation was still widespread, and protests against the proposal were vehement in general. Of course, the problem could have been solved by a devaluation of the currency, which would have made it possible to restore convertibility without deflation, but such a proposal was unacceptable, for it would involve Parliament not simply in condoning the iniquity of inflation, but in forcing the Bank of England to abrogate the contractual obligation embodied in the law and printed on every one of its notes, and would set a precedent that future governments might use to evade the consequences of financial irresponsibility. Thus, the motion for devaluation in 1819 could not even find a seconder. Ricardo persuaded Parliament that action could not any longer be delayed, and that the impact of restoration would be minimal, so that the bill was passed without recorded division, despite the widespread reservations. The passage of the bill was immediately followed by speculation against the expected appreciation of the currency, and by falling prices as the depression deepened, so that it was possible to restore convertibility in 1821. In the event, fears of the opponents of convertibility were largely confirmed following restoration, the damage being compounded by the fact that, far from stabilizing the economy, the mismanagement of the currency intensified the economic cycles that produced acute distress in the agricultural districts and in Midlands manufacturing. In 1819, Ricardo had estimated that a fall in prices of 5 or 6% would be sufficient to establish equilibrium at the old parity. Prices actually fell 13% in 1819 alone, and a further 20% between 1819 and 1824. Ricardo, true to form but against all the evidence, blamed the decline in prices on mismanagement by the Bank of England. In fact, the bulk of the decline was caused neither by the restoration of convertibility nor by the Bank of England's errors, but by a European-wide depression that was at worst intensified by monetary deflation. The depression was widely blamed on the restoration of convertibility. Atwood expressed the opposition of the small Birmingham manufacturers, advocating currency reform and the free availability of credit until full employment was restored. Cobbett expressed the opposition of the farmers, who similarly called for devaluation and a reduction in the burden of taxation. The export trades saw the problem in a wider context, as reflecting a lack of purchasing power in the hands of foreigners with which to buy British goods, and it advocated the abolition of British protective tariffs to open the market to foreign suppliers, having an eye especially on the South American market. It was the latter voice, particularly as it was articulated through Ricardo's Political Economy Club, to which the government listened, standing fast on the currency issue, but initiating the liberalization of trade that made steady progress over the following 20 years. Reciprocal free trade agreements were negotiated with the major European powers over the period of 1823 to 1830. Colonial trade was relaxed, and the remaining commercial monopolies abolished. Trade liberalization, like the currency question, met with opposition even from those who were in principle free traders. Baring, who had introduced the London Merchants' Petition, calling for free trade in 1820, also led the defense of the silk industry against the removal of protection in 1824. Such apparently contradictory positions were reconciled by the argument that protection was necessary so long as domestic producers had to suffer the higher labor costs that were the result of the Corn Law. Thus, the Corn Laws were made the pivot of the free trade case. There were signs that worried the landowners that the government was beginning to question the wisdom of the Corn Laws on the grounds that they fostered price instability and popular unrest, while the squeeze on profits threatened a flight of capital abroad. However, the Corn Laws, although amended, were not yet to be repealed. Recovery in 1823 stilled urban discontent, although agriculture was still depressed and rural protests continued to simmer. The easing of urban tension raised the question of the repeal of the Combination Acts. that had been introduced in the attempt to suppress the radical agitation at the end of the 18th century. Political economists believed that trades unions could not increase the general level of wages, but could only benefit one group of workers at the expense of others. Political economists believe that trades unions could not increase the general level of wages, but could only benefit one group of workers at the expense of others. However, most of them followed Smith in believing that moderate trade unionism could enhance competition by redressing the imbalance of power between workers and unscrupulous employers and establishing more uniform wage rates. More to the point, as far as the government was concerned, the Combination Acts had not suppressed trade unions, but merely driven them underground and into the arms of radical agitators. Thus, the repeal of the Combination Acts in 1824, yeah? Yeah. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Oh. Okay, cool. Thank you. More to the point, as far as the government was concerned, the Combination Acts had not suppressed trade unions, but merely driven them underground and into the arms of radical agitators. Thus, the repeal of the Combinations Act in 1824 was above all an attempt to separate legitimate trade union activity from illegitimate political agitation. The hope that trade unions would simply disappear once they were legalized, as some political economists had predicted, was soon shattered. The rapid growth of trade unions in the boom led to further legislation in 1825 that severely restricted trade union rights. The recovery of 1823 precipitated the first modern cycle of boom and slump. The boom was sustained by the expansion of credit by the Bank of England, despite an unfavorable turn in the balance of payments, rising domestic prices, and pressure on the exchanges. The boom spilled over into speculation on the stock exchange, particularly in foreign investments. The Bank of England eventually began to contract credit to restore the exchanges, but only to precipitate a crisis, as the scarcity of credit undermined the solvency of traders and speculators, leading to the failure of around 70 London and country banks. The Bank of England had to step in to save the financial system from collapse, lending freely to provide liquidity to commerce and the banking system, which survived the crisis by the skin of its teeth. Nevertheless, the crisis led to a wave of bankruptcies of productive and commercial capitalists who had traded on credit, and a collapse of trade and prices. The crisis led to renewed agitation from the domestic farmers and manufacturers, who again blamed the Bank of England's contraction of the currency and the government's liberalization policies for the crisis. Other critics blamed the crisis on the earlier overexpansion of the currency by the bank. It was Ricardo's political economy that came worst out of the crisis, having to shoulder the blame for the full range of policies that it had inspired. The Bank of England successfully passed the buck to the country banks. The bank's position was reflected in the restriction on the note issue of the country banks and in the Bank Charter Act of 1826, which permitted the establishment of joint stock banks outside London and encouraged the Bank of England to set up provincial branches. Although the bank resisted the demands of its critics, the crisis did mark a quiet change in the policy of the Bank of England, although it was not publicly acknowledged, modifying the old orthodoxy of the real bills doctrine and partially adopting the policy that had been advocated by Ricardo of regulating the currency in accordance with the flow of gold. In stimulating the overexpansion and the boom, the bank had followed its old policy of meeting the, quote, legitimate demands of commerce, end quote, despite the weakening of exchanges. In its move to contract the currency, however, the bank had restricted credit in response to an outflow of gold, as advocated by the Ricardian theory. On the other hand, when the crisis broke, the demand for gold was precipitated by domestic failures, the exchanges having already reached a balance, and the bank responded by expanding credit again to meet the needs of commerce. Thus, it followed a Ricardian policy in response to a foreign drain of gold, but an accommodating policy in response to a domestic drain. Although the banking system was stabilized in the wake of the crisis, the Depression continued, particularly in agricultural districts, stimulating a renewal of political agitation. In previous depressions, recovery had followed the slump rapidly. In previous depressions, recovery had followed slump relatively rapidly and had curtailed the growth of agitation. This time, however, recovery was only modest and patchy, and the pressure for reform steadily built up. The issues that lay behind the upsurge of protest were diverse, and the substantive demands of different interests were mutually contradictory. But the various strands came together over the issue of parliamentary reform to destroy the political monopoly of the narrow elite of landowners and financiers who subordinated their political duties to their own interests. Political economy and constitutional reform. Political economy played a limited role in the reform agitation. Although political economists tended to be politically liberal and to have democratic inclinations, they were not over-concerned about constitutional issues. The important consideration was that the country should have good government, and good government could be achieved within a variety of constitutional arrangements. Thus, David Hume and Adam Smith had paid much less attention to the definition of particular constitutional arrangements than had earlier legal and political theorists, tempering any liberal zeal with an almost Burkean concern with the dangers of tampering with established institutions. This was the context within which political economists approached the reform of the Constitution. Although good government would tend to require a constitution with a strong democratic component to check the power of the state, the reform of the franchise was a pragmatic matter. As Ricardo had observed reassuringly, the bourgeoisie did not seek the extension of the franchise for its own sake, but only as a means to securing the good government that seemed unattainable within the existing constitution. Quote, "It is not universal suffrage as an end, but as a means of good government, that the partisans of that measure ask for universal suffrage." End quote. Ricardo. Above all else, good government required the freedom and security of property, while the widest possible franchise is desirable to ensure that as many people as possible are able to defend their rights. Popular ignorance, greed, and envy might dispose the poorer majority of the population to abuse their numerical strength and use the state to attack property, whether by expropriation or taxation. This problem later came to be discussed euphemistically in terms of the problem of the, quote, tyranny of the majority, end quote, or of the, quote, oppression of the minority by the majority, end quote. But in the 1830s was addressed more frankly. With a population enlightened by the truths of political economy, a universal franchise would hold no fears. However, the condition of the working class was such that most feared that emotion would get the better of intelligence, a fear that was confirmed not only by political radicalism, but also by the popular enthusiasm for inflationism, the relief of distress and protection. Thus, all but the most optimistic political economists believed that the franchise had to be restricted by a more or less stringent property qualification. Political economy could reconcile the democratic form of the Constitution with its undemocratic content on the basis of its demonstration that the freedom and security of property not only served the common interest, but also the individual interest of every member of society, since the theory of political economy established that the working class had no distinct interest. It had no particular need for independent political representation. By the same token, women had no need for independent representation, since their interests were adequately represented by their fathers and husbands. By 1832, agitation for reform had become almost irresistible, and the increasingly radical turn taken by the agitation was as it mobilized the working class, led Parliament to relent for fear of worse. When reform came in 1832, the franchise was extended as little as was consistent with the aspirations of the bourgeoisie. Indeed, the 1832 reform was significant more for its reform of constituency boundaries than for its extension of the franchise, which in the more democratic constituencies was contracted. In 1831, 3.8% of the population over the age of 20 were enfranchised. In 1833, the proportion had risen only to 5.9%. Thus, the 1832 Reform Bill did not transfer power from one class to another, but rather broadened the basis of representation of the capitalist class, as the big capital of land, finance, and commerce was persuaded, by the threat of popular radicalism, to admit the smaller capital of farming and manufacturing to a subordinate share in the Constitution. The 1832 Reform Bill settled the constitutional question for a time, but it did not resolve the substantive issue that lay behind the reform agitation. Although the various sections of the reform movement made common cause over the constitutional issue, their policy aspirations conflicted with one another, so that once represented in Parliament, they did not come together to form a coherent opposition, but ranged themselves on either side of the established division, while the limited extension of the franchise ensured that the more radical demands of the working class and smaller farmers and manufacturers remained largely unrepresented. In fact, the class composition of the House of Commons hardly changed at all, while reform left the power of the aristocracy entrenched in the Lords. The continuation of open balloting until 1872 and extensive corruption in elections, reduced but not eliminated by the Act of 1854, helped to keep parliamentary representation in, quote, responsible hands, end quote, and sovereignty was still felt to lie with Parliament rather than the people. However, governments had to become more responsive to the opinion of the electorate, and party organization became more important, both inside and outside Parliament. Thus, the 1832 reform ensured that henceforth the bourgeoisie would settle its differences within the Constitution, united in the defense of its common class interest by the common threat of a growing working class movement. The reformed state and economic regulation. The growing complexity of the problems facing the government and the program of administrative and financial reform after 1832 brought political economists into the center of government, giving them an unprecedented opportunity to put their program into practice. The real exponents of laissez-faire in mid-Victorian Britain were centrally involved in government. The great exponents of laissez-faire in mid-Victorian Britain were centrally involved in government, as civil servants, members of royal commissions, and members of Parliament. The 1832 Reform Bill divided the reform movement, isolating the more radical elements, led by Cobbett and Atwood, who had demanded currency reform and the relief of distress. Far from meeting their demands, the reformed Parliament immediately passed the 1833 Bank Charter Act that strengthened the grip of the Bank of England and set in motion the reform of the Poor Laws. Political economy had expressed the opposition of capitalists to the old Poor Laws ever since Adam Smith. The Poor Laws restricted the mobility of labor and subsidized wages, stimulating the growth of population, undermining the competitiveness of the labor market, devaluing the virtues of prudence and frugality, and eroding the incentive to work. The growing cost of the Poor Laws had made reform inevitable, but reform was resisted not only by the working class, but also by the agricultural interest for whom it secured a cheap supply of labor and provided the institutional form through which they could maintain the paternalistic relationships on which their authority rested. By 1832, there were few political economists who still favored the complete abolition of the Poor Laws. Growing working-class agitation made it clear that moral education, supplemented by charitable provision for the deserving poor, would be insufficient to suppress discontent. The alternative to the Poor Law was not so much education as the militia. as Nassau Sr., who played a leading role in the reform of the Poor Law, was ready to modify the dogmas of political economy in the light of pragmatic political considerations. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act was a compromise between the conflicting interests. However, Senior ensured that the new poor law was so constructed as to impede as little as possible the operation of the labor market. The abolition of outdoor relief, the workhouse test, and the principles of, quote, less eligibility were designed to ensure that recourse to the poor law was a last resort. The first years of the Reformed Parliament were years of industrial but not agricultural prosperity that quietened the radical agitation, although not resistance to the implementation of the new poor law, particularly in the North. The course of the boom and subsequent crash closely mirrored that of the cycle 10 years earlier, with the Bank of England fueling the boom until balance of payments pressures led it to a mild restriction of credit, which precipitated a commercial crisis. Although the financial crisis of 1839 was not as severe as a decade earlier, the Depression was worse as exports failed to recover and agriculture suffered a series of bad harvests. The Depression of 1839 to 41 stimulated a renewal of political agitation. The disparate strands of popular protest were united around the issue of the vote expressed in the charter drawn up in 1838, which provided the basis for popular agitation for the following decade. The demand for votes was not an abstract demand for political rights, but the means to overthrow a constitution that still institutionalized the power of money, land, and the established church. Chartism was a revolutionary working-class movement in the sense that Chartism confronted the state as the institutionalized power of the capitalist class. But the main thrust of Chartism did not lie in the mobilization of an industrial proletariat against its employers, for the industrial proletariat was still only a minority of the working class as a whole. Although Chartist agitation in the northern industrial towns was directed against the power of the employers, the power of capital was more generally identified with the power of land and of money. The fact that Chartism built on the established rhetoric of radicalism and did not, on the whole, attack the employers directly meant that it could incorporate not only the radical petite bourgeoisie, but even small employers, often burdened by debt and unable to secure credit, who shared its opposition to the power of the bankers. However, the increasingly revolutionary radicalism of Chartism no longer appealed to the bulk of the bourgeoisie, who looked for alternative solutions, both for their own grievances and for the economic instability that produced distress and fueled the radicalism that threatened their own relatively privileged position. The liberal reforms of the 1840s, in response to the agitation of the Anti-Corn Law League, successfully detached the middle class from the more radical demands of Chartism, culminating in the enthusiastic mobilization of the middle class against the Chartist threat in 1848. 1848. The currency issue was raised again by the need to renew the charter of the Bank of England. Far from strengthening pressure for a discretionary policy of free credit, radical agitation increased fears of inflationism and ensured that it was the conservative doctrines of the, quote, currency school, derived from Ricardo, that prevailed. The currency school saw cyclical fluctuations that were the source of the waves of distress and disorder as the result of financial instability that derived from the excessive discretion accorded to the Bank of England in the regulation of the currency. The overissue of the currency in times of prosperity stimulated overtrading and speculation that could only be checked by a bout of depression. The solution was to insist that the bank should be constrained to regulate the currency so that it operated exactly as would a metallic currency, by restricting its issue to the size of its reserves of gold. This principle would remove the discretionary element from the bank's monetary policies and prevent the emergence of cyclical fluctuations. Inflationary expansion, which precipitated a drain on the bank's gold reserves, would provoke an automatic contraction of the currency until prices fell sufficiently to restore equilibrium. The currency school was opposed by the, quote, banking school, which favored a greater degree of discretion. However, the banking school did not represent the demands of popular radicalism so much as the old banking orthodoxy that had by now been abandoned even by the Bank of England. The economists of the banking school argued that the rigid regulation of the money supply would at best be unnecessary and ineffective. The economists of the banking school insisted that an outflow of gold frequently arose from exceptional causes, such as a bad harvest, investment flows, or the disruption of foreign trade, which would be self-correcting. To contract the currency in such circumstances would merely exaggerate the difficulties to no useful purpose. They also argued that variations in the currency had only a very indirect impact on prices, and often at the cost of considerable disruption. On the one hand, they noted that private banks had considerable latitude in the cash ratios that they maintained, so could easily expand credit even when the note issue was contracting and vice versa. On the other hand, if the contraction of the currency did feed through to the contraction of credit, it would only produce a fall in prices by precipitating a severe contraction of trade. The conclusion of the banking school was that, so long as convertibility of the currency is maintained, an over-issue is impossible because circulation will only absorb banknotes to the extent that banknotes are required to maintain circulation. The faults lay not in the orthodox principles of banking, but in the administration of those principles by the Bank of England. The victory of the currency school was sealed in the Bank Charter Act of 1844, which separated the banking from the issuing functions of the bank, the confusion of which was in the past felt to have contributed to instability. The issue department was entitled to issue notes against securities of up to £14 million, the fiduciary issue, and in addition against any bullion that it might hold, buying gold and paying notes on demand at a fixed price. This ensured that the note issue would vary strictly from within limits set by the flow of gold. The banking department was then freed from regulation to conduct the normal banking business of taking deposits, discounting bills, and extending loans. The bank itself strongly favored the measure, not least because the measure freed the Bank of England from responsibility for the discretionary regulation of the currency, and so from responsibility for monetary disturbances, while also freeing its banking activity from restraint. The 1844 Act continued to regulate the activity of the Bank of England until 1914. Monetary reform might free commerce from monetary disturbances, but it could not deal with the more fundamental problem of limited export markets. Failing export prices and successive trade crises had led to increasingly insistent demands for the export trades for trade liberalization, culminating in the formation of the Anti-Corn Law League in 1839, which is the precursor of modern popular politics in mobilizing public opinion to exert political pressure within the Constitution. The issue of free trade was fundamental because, while exporters found no shortage of foreign demand for their products, their prices undercutting those of small domestic producers, foreign customers lacked the means to purchase them because their own predominantly agricultural products were excluded from British markets by protective tariffs. Moreover, the absence of return cargoes increased shipping costs. This problem was particularly acute because the absence of developed financial institutions and stable currencies in Britain's main markets was a barrier to the stimulation of trade by the extension of credit and by foreign investment, which had repeatedly been checked by financial crisis. Thus, foreigners could only purchase British goods with the proceeds of their own exports, usually represented by bills of exchange drawn on London. Tariff barriers to the penetration of European and United States markets were of less immediate significance, but the fear remained that if Britain persisted with protection, foreigners would retaliate by erecting further barriers of their own. The Corn Laws were the focus of agitation and of resistance, because the Corn Laws most closely affected the interests of the landed classes, but the demand for trade liberalization extended to all protective tariffs, and through the Anti-Corn Law League was further associated with the full range of liberal reformist demands. By the 1840s, the Corn Laws had become more a symbol than an effective measure in support of domestic agriculture. The government's reluctance to liberalize trade for fear of losing revenue was soon overcome as tariff reductions were followed by such a growth of trade as hardly to affect revenues. Thus, through the 1840s, protection was progressively removed, culminating in the repeal of the Navigation Acts in 1849. tariff reform was supplemented by war and diplomacy to open up the markets of Asia and to check Russian expansionism. The Navy maintained the security of property on the high seas and the gunboat in distant lands, while the established colonies served as strategic bases for the maintenance of the Pax Britannica. The administrative reform of the state. The principles of political economy were not limited in their application to the role of the state in the regulation of the banking system and in securing the freedom of trade. Political economy, allied with utilitarianism, also played a central role in the renewed bout of legal, administrative, and financial reforms after 1840 that were designed to reduce the element of arbitrariness and discretion in the application of the law and the administration of government. The unreformed state had institutionalized the power of the landed class on the basis of its exclusive claim to represent the general interest in its attachment to the order and tranquility of society. The 1832 Reform Bill allowed other property interests to take their place alongside the landed interest, which thereby became merely one interest among others. However, the 1832 reform did nothing to change the administrative apparatus of the state, which remained in the hands of those of rank and property, through which they exercised their powers in their own interest. Although the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835 extended the principles of 1832 to the major towns, the powers it gave them were limited, the only requirement being to institute watch committees to supervise the police. Most local administration continued to be in the hands of the justices and of a proliferation of ad hoc local authorities subject to little supervision or control and exercising a considerable degree of discretion. Central government had few powers. Recruitment to the administration was still based on patronage, and administrative procedures were largely ad hoc. The system of taxation and borrowing had been regularized in the 18th century to meet the financial needs of war, but there was no centralized system of control of government finances, taxes going directly to spending departments. Even the elementary step of the separation of public from private funds and the introduction of rigorous accounting for public money had only been introduced in the 1780s. The task of the reform of government administration and finance was to transform the state from the tool of a particular class exercising arbitrary powers within a discretionary framework into the institutionalized representative of the general interest, imposing its authority on all particular interests on the basis of the rigorous separation of public from private powers. The general principles of reform were defined by utilitarianism, but it was political economy that gave these principles their substantive content. For political economy, the general interest was not identified with any particular interest, nor was it the sum of particular interest. The general interest was represented exclusively by the rule of law and of money, which secured the formal freedom and equality of property and of exchange. In principle, the powers of the state were limited to the administration of justice and the defense of the realm, which required only the establishment of the rule of law, of proper systems of taxation, and the proper regulation of the issue of the currency. However, pragmatic considerations soon led political economists to recognize the need for more extensive intervention of the government, particularly in the areas of public health, education, the poor law, and, reluctantly, factory legislation. The task was to develop appropriate legal, administrative, and financial forms through which the state could exercise its increasingly extensive powers. The essential principles of public administration developed by utilitarianism were based on the analogy of the market, regulated by the abstract powers of money and the law. The formal equality of the market ensured that its rule applied equally to all citizens and in that sense was predictable. Where public administration was required to replace or supplement the rule of the market, it should similarly apply equally to all citizens and be predictable in its impact. This implied the reduction to a minimum of the scope for political and administrative discretion in public administration. The ideal form of administrative intervention was not the exercise of power by public officials, but the rigid and impartial application of law and administrative regulation subject to financial control and judicial review. When the primary role of law and public administration had been to sanction the powers of particular forms of property, the class character of the judiciary and of the administration was essential to its role. However, the increasingly active use of legislation as a means of government administration, which implied the subordination of particular powers to the abstract power of property in the form of money, meant that the discretion of public officers had to be checked by bringing them more effectively under the rule of law. This was attempted by the streamlining and strengthening of the courts that got underway in the 1830s, providing easier access to the law and a check on the capriciousness of the magistracy, and by the progressive separation of law and public administration that was pioneered in the administration of the new poor law. However, the, quote, independence, end quote, of the judiciary that was essential to the judiciary's proper functioning presented a constant barrier to the attempt to rationalize the rule of law, while the independence of public administration rapidly increased the scope for administrative discretion. The judiciary had a dual role to play in the exercise of public authority. On the one hand, the judiciary was required to enforce the exercise of public powers sanctioned by the law. On the other hand, the law was required to check administrative discretion by confining public power within the law. The former role brought the judiciary into play as an agent of the state. The latter role brought the judiciary into play as an independent check on the power of the state. These dual roles could only be fulfilled if the judiciary and the magistracy were independent of all particular interest and popular pressures on the one hand, and independent of the state on the other. The independence of the judiciary from popular pressure could only be secured by the recruitment of the judiciary and the magistracy from a very narrow social stratum, and its independence from the state could only be secured by its self-recruitment, which meant that the judiciary and the magistracy tended to be a self-perpetuating elite drawn from persons of rank and status. Cloaking the gentry and the younger sons of the aristocracy in the majesty of the law could not conceal their class origins or the class interests that they represented. Thus the, quote, independence of the judiciary reinforced the class character of the state, but at the same time presented a barrier to the state's rationalization. The same contradiction underlay the continuation of similar patterns of recruitment of the military and civil service and of local officials, and the protection of military expenditure and administrative activity from parliamentary scrutiny and control. Although the appropriate administrative form of the state was that of a strictly regulated and publicly accountable apparatus whose powers derived from parliamentary legislation, for the utilitarians and political economists, Parliament was not usually the best body to draw up the rules and regulations in question, although it obviously had to approve relevant legislation and receive regular reports. The issues were frequently complicated technical issues that required expert judgment and the evaluation of a wealth of evidence. Thus, the Royal Commission began to replace the Parliamentary Select Committee as the forum within which detailed policy debate took place after 1830, while the formulation and implementation of policy was placed increasingly in the hands of various boards, out of which eventually developed a professional civil service. Although the new forms of administration were gradually brought under parliamentary control through the mechanism of ministerial responsibility, Parliament had neither the information nor the expertise to evaluate their activity. The independence of the administration from Parliament was also necessary if policies that served the general interest were to prevail against the obstructionism of vested interest and private prejudice. Political economy and utilitarianism offered a scientific basis on which to evaluate policy proposals, and so legitimated the evaluation, development, and implementation of policies by experts out of the gaze of Parliament or the public. For example, state provision for education that was of central importance for political economy was bedeviled by the religious question, so that Parliament was completely bypassed in the early development of public education. The Education Board was set up without reference to Parliament, so had no statutory powers at all, although in practice the Education Board wielded considerable power because it administered grants in aid. Similarly, Chadwick used his administrative position and political contacts to campaign long and hard against determined parliamentary and local opposition for the 1848 Public Health Act, which only scraped through Parliament on the back of the cholera scare. The absence of any centralized system of financial accounting and control before the last third of the 19th century, and the lack of any centralized bureaucratic apparatus outside the military meant that administration initially took the form of legal regulation rather than bureaucratic hierarchy. The ideal form of administration, pioneered by the administration of the New Poor Law, was that in which a central board laid down the general principles of administration to ensure rationality, uniformity, and efficiency, and through an inspectorate superintended their implementation by local boards, the unavoidable discretionary element of whose activity was in the hands of elected local representatives, so bypassing the justices. The principle of imposing the cost of each policy as directly as possible on its beneficiaries dictated that each agency should have its own revenue-raising powers, usually through local rates, which also had the desirable consequence of limiting expenditure strictly to the capacity to raise the requisite revenue. Expenditure of national rather than purely logical significance was assisted by central government grants, which provided scope for greater leverage from the center. In practice, things did not work out as simply as this, and the first attempts to establish a rational and uniform system of public administration had limited success. Issues that the reformers considered to be technical were deemed by others to be intensely political, while the entrenched power of vested interest, masquerading as the independence of the judiciary and of local administration, presented formidable barriers to reform. Resistance to central direction meant that legislation tended to be permissive rather than obligatory, implementation being left largely to local initiative. The limited financial and administrative resources of the central boards prevented them from enforcing their policies on local authorities, which remained largely in the hands of the locally powerful, who retained a considerable degree of discretion. In practice, the boards could often do little more than use their reports to bring problems to public attention and to propose remedies. More effective intervention could only be achieved on the basis of political centralization and the development of appropriate forms of bureaucratic, administrative, and financial control. However, concerted opposition from vested interests delayed the development of such a centralized system of public administration until the last third of the 19th century. The limitations of legal regulation and the rationalization of the structure of public administration implied the professionalization and bureaucratization of the civil service. Professionalization and the development of appropriate bureaucratic procedures took place in some departments, most notably the Board of Trade from the 1820s. The new boards, pioneered by the Benthamite reformers, similarly sought to develop efficient administrative procedures as they were established. However, the core of the civil service continued to be run on the administrative principles of the 18th century, with recruitment based on patronage and political reliability rather than administrative competence. The inefficiency and incompetence of the old established departments was brought dramatically to public attention with the debacle of the Crimean War, which brought the issue of professionalization and recruitment to a head. The basis of reform was the Northcote-Trevelyan Report of 1853, which recommended recruitment and promotion on merit within a hierarchical bureaucratic form of administration. However, recruitment on merit by no means implied abandoning the class base of the civil service. Indeed, for Gladstone, quote, one of the great recommendations of the charge, in my eyes, would be its tendency to strengthen and multiply the ties between the higher classes and the possession of administrative power, end quote, Gladstone, and in response to the fear that competitive entry, finally introduced in 1870, will be dominated by the products of Eton, Harrow, Rugby, and the public schools, end quote. He argued that the superior natural gifts and acquired advantages of the aristocracy, quote, irrespective of book learning, end quote, would ensure their, quote, immense superiority, end quote. The whole point of the reform was to separate the work of the administration, quote, into mechanical and intellectual, a separation which will open to the highly educated class a career and give them a command over all the higher parts of the civil service, which up to this time they have never enjoyed, end quote. In fact, the reforms did broaden the class base of the civil service slightly, to include the professional middle class, which had fully proved its political reliability in 1848. The rationalization of the law and of public administration was accompanied by a rationalization of public finance. The fundamental principle was that public expenditure, with very few exceptions, was unproductive. This expenditure could only be financed by drawing on the net product of society that comprised profits, interest, and rent, which was also the principal source of savings and investment. If savings and so future prosperity were not to be undermined, the state had to minimize its expenditure by limiting the scope of its activity and the cost of its administration. This consideration gave added weight to the preference for legal rather than bureaucratic forms of administrative regulation. All public expenditure should be financed out of current taxation and taxes levied according to the principles laid down by Adam Smith. If taxes did not meet expenditure, the government would have to have recourse to borrowing. However, borrowing was undesirable for a number of reasons. If taxes did not meet expenditure, the government would have to have recourse to borrowing. However, borrowing was undesirable for a number of reasons. Firstly, borrowing drew on the public's savings, directly diverting resources from productive investment to unproductive public use. Secondly, borrowing was not a substitute for taxation, but merely deferred the imposition of taxes that would have to be levied in the future to meet the increasing burden of interest payments that already made up a large proportion of central government expenditure. Thirdly, there was a fear that in an emergency, particularly a war, it would be difficult to raise funds if there was a large burden of outstanding debt. Fourthly, recourse to borrowing put the government in the hands of the city. For these reasons, it was believed that honest and prudent governments should aim at least to balance the annual budget, and preferably to budget for a surplus to repay the accumulated national debt. Despite these strictures, this outstanding debt served an important stabilizing role by providing a safe, quote, gilt-edged, end quote, investment that provided the measure against which riskier investments had to justify themselves. Moreover, it gave the government, through the Bank of England, some leverage in financial markets that was increasingly used as the means of implementing its monetary policies from the 1870s. These principles of public finance had already been generally accepted by the end of the 18th century, although the demands of war made frequent recourse to borrowing necessary. However, peacetime borrowing was scorned, and the doctrine of the balanced budget became the prime test of the moral virtue of the government. The result was that servicing the debt accounted for 40% of general government expenditure in 1790, rising to over 50% in 1815, and then gradually falling to 42% in 1840, 18% in 1890, and 7% in 1910, before the First World War increased borrowing dramatically. Moreover, the doctrine of the balanced budget was not merely a moral exhortation. The doctrine of the balanced budget was seen as an essential part of the Constitution itself, policed by the financial markets that followed Smith in regarding increased public borrowing as the first stage on the road to financial ruin, to be inexorably followed by debasement of the currency and national bankruptcy. The need to finance wartime expenditure meant that an appropriate system of government borrowing was established relatively early. It took much longer to establish control over the system of revenue and expenditure, without which proper government budgeting was impossible. Taxation had largely been brought under government control during the 18th century, as tax farming was replaced by central government collection. However, it was not until 1846 that central control was fully established, with all taxes being paid into a central fund, rather than going directly to spending departments. It took still longer to bring expenditure, particularly of the defense departments, under control. In the end, it was Gladstone who was the architect of the system through which the principles of political economy could be rigorously applied to the regulation of the public finances. The establishment of the Department of Exchequer and Audit in 1861 and the Public Accords Committee of the House of Commons in 1866 were the twin pillars of administrative and political control, regulating and accounting for the flow of revenue and expenditure through the Central Consolidated Fund on a continuous basis. It was only with the establishment of this regular system of accounting and financial control that government departments could be made properly accountable for their expenditure, according to the government's spending and revenue plans and projections laid down in the annual budget and financial statement. It was not surprising, therefore, that individual spending departments should fight long and hard against such control. Although the Treasury had got the upper hand by the First World War, the battle continues to be fought out year by year. The reconstruction of the state was not associated with a substantial increase in the functions of the state, the size of the administration, or the levels of its expenditure. Before the 1860s, local resistance to administrative centralization meant that central government had acquired few direct administrative responsibilities. Apart from the post office, the direct responsibilities of central government did not go far beyond its responsibility for the judiciary and the military, and even where it was active, it had very few resources to implement its policies. In 1848, the Home Office, ultimately responsible, among other things, for the factory inspectorate, the police, and the poor laws, employed 24 clerks. Jesus Christ. The expansion in government administration occurred through the proliferation of local bodies established under general or local legislation. At the same time, as central government employed 29,000 civil servants, the majority in customs and excise, as compared with 198,000 in military service, there were about 80,000 local authorities of one kind or another. The proliferation of local bodies was accompanied by a proliferation of local rates and charges, levied according to Smith's principle that the beneficiaries of a service should meet its cost. The lack of effective central supervision and the cumbersome and partial exercise of legal regulation meant that local bodies could exercise very considerable discretion. Progressive municipal corporations achieved some rationalization of local authorities and introduced wide-ranging municipal improvements in public health, roads, housing, education, and public utilities under general and local legislation. However, all such initiatives came up against the barrier of vested interests, which in many cases were sufficient to keep the activity of the local administration to a minimum. When it comes to the administrative activity of the state, the astonishing thing is how little change there was in the relative size and distribution of state expenditure and in the essential duties undertaken by the state throughout the 19th century. In 1790, general government expenditure accounted for 12% of the GDP. In 1840, general government expenditure still accounted for 12%, and in 1890 it was down to 9%. Even in absolute terms, general government expenditure only increased from £23 million in 1790 to £131 million in 1890. If we leave debt service out of account, about half of government expenditure throughout the 19th century was devoted to the defense of the realm and defense of property, the first two duties that Smith defined for the state. Apart from general administration, the next largest components of public expenditure were education, the third of Smith's essential duties of the state in maintaining the rule of property, and poor relief, which Smith decried, but which is equally a method of maintaining the necessary relations of authority and subordination. In its function, the state conformed closely to Smith's prescription throughout the 19th century, as it largely had in the 18th. Although the functions of the state had not changed, there had been fundamental changes in the form of the state, based on the growing separation of the state from civil society that considerably increased the power of government. Whereas the state in the 18th century had little relevance to the mass of the population, by the mid-19th century they were embraced by a web of regulation that was still locally administered, but that was under increasingly rigorous central supervision and control. The paradox is resolved when it is realized that the power of the national state was exercised primarily through legal regulation, not through bureaucratic forms of administration. Thus, John Stuart Mill could still contest, in 1862, the argument that increasing state intervention was, quote, an unavoidable consequence and indisputable instrument of progress, end quote, on the grounds that increased intervention had tended to take the form of new legislation rather than, quote, discretionary authority, still less control, end quote. The separation of the state from civil society and the subordination of private to public power did not imply that the state had assumed a role of supreme power as the central regulating agency. The need to ensure that rational policy-making was subordinated to the general interest and not subverted by self-interest, ignorance, irresponsibility, or emotion informed the whole framework of constitutional, legal, financial, and administrative reform. For political economy, the role of the state was strictly subordinate to the roles of law and of money in regulating social reproduction. The subordination of the state to the law and to money was institutionalized in the form of the state. The law served to check the arbitrary and discretionary exercise of state power, political resistance to taxation, the discipline of financial markets, and the 1844 Bank Act all ensured that government would be forced to keep public expenditure within proper limits. The need to sustain its revenues ensured that the government had an interest in the expansion of trade, that through customs and excise provided the primary source of the state's revenue. The need to finance its borrowing ensured that the government had an interest in the stability and growth of financial markets. The need to meet the state's financial obligations ensured that the state had an interest in maintaining the integrity of the currency. If this was not sufficient, the property franchise and the class basis of recruitment to the civil service, the military, and the judiciary, and their protection from parliamentary control ensured that state power would be in the hands of those who had the greatest interest in maintaining the rule of law and in limiting the ambition of the state. In short, the separation of the state from civil society in no sense implied that the state stood above civil society as an independent power. However, the limits on the power of the state were not limits set by particular interest or political factions, but were limits set by the abstract and universal power of the law and of money, by the Constitution, and by the class character of recruitment to the administration. The mid-Victorian boom. The implementation of the program of political economy from the 1840s proved rather more successful than had been the early attempts at liberalization in the 1820s. The, quote, Hungry 40s was a decade of financial instability, widespread depression, and mass starvation, insurrection, and revolution, but gave way in the 1850s to the mid-Victorian boom. The boom was not a period of unbroken prosperity and social peace, but the contrast with the 40s was startling. The continued cyclical form of boom and slump remained the one blot on the copybook of political economy. The 1844 Bank Act was supposed to have removed the source of economic fluctuations. However, things did not work out quite so smoothly in practice. A slow recovery from the crash of 1842 quickened with the railways boom in the middle of the decade, which fed growing speculation in railway shares on the stock exchange. The boom broke in 1845 in the wake of poor harvest and deteriorating export prospects, with the consequent drain of bullion and rising interest rates. However, continuing investment in the railways as a result of previous speculative promotions sustained the economy until 1847, when a major financial crisis led to widespread bankruptcies. The crash focused attention yet again on the Bank of England. The separation of its banking from its issue business under the 1844 Act had left the Bank of England free to conduct its banking business as though it were an ordinary commercial bank, so it had continued to feed the speculative boom by pursuing an increasingly aggressive discount policy, even when the exchanges became unfavorable. Eventually, the drain on the reserves led the bank to raise bank rate sharply and to contract its discounts. Eventually, the drain on the reserves led the bank to raise bank rate sharply and to contract its discounts, putting strong pressure on commerce. The crisis broke in October 1847 when the collapse of corn prices following an abundant harvest led to the bankruptcy of corn speculators, which spread to the banks that had financed the speculators, and then to the foreign trading companies who had maintained unfavorable positions by the heavy use of accommodation credit, finally leading to a run on the Bank of England, which was only checked when the government offered to suspend the restrictions of the Bank Act. The crash appeared to vindicate the banking school's insistence on the distinction between money and credit. The boom had been stimulated not by the overissue of the currency, but by the overexpansion of bank credit that had been facilitated by the bank's discount policy. The crash had been precipitated, just as the banking school had warned, not by a drain on the currency reserves, but by a liquidity crisis in the banking system, which led to a drain on the reserves of the banking department. This criticism was implicitly accepted by the bank, which increasingly acted in crises as lender of last resort, keeping out of the discount market in a boom, but making accommodation available to maintain the liquidity of the banking system in a recession, although the bank's obligations in this respect were not acknowledged until the 1870s. Thus, the crisis was not seen as undermining the principles of monetary regulation embodied in the 1844 Act, but only as demonstrating the need for the bank to have regard to the monetary. Thus, the crisis was not seen as undermining the principles of monetary regulation embodied in the 1844 Act, but only as demonstrating the need for the bank to have regard to the monetary consequences of its credit policies. In addition, the crisis indicated the need for the bank to increase the size of its gold reserves, so giving still greater importance to the expansion of exports made possible by the liberalization of trade and fostered by aggressive commercial policies on the part of the government. The depression that followed the crisis was very uneven in its impact. The lag between projection and construction meant that railway construction and the related coal, iron, and engineering industries were sustained through the depression, but the export trades were severely depressed. Chartism, which had lost momentum during the economic recovery in the middle of the decade, showed renewed vigor, but was met, as before, with intense repression. Moreover, the division within Chartism between the class-based demands of the industrial proletariat and the popular radicalism that was the basis of the wider appeal of Chartism increasingly undermined the unity of the movement. The recovery from the depression was faster and more dramatic than anyone could have anticipated. However, recovery was not based on the traditional export trade of cotton, but on the international expansion of the railways, compounded by the demands of the Crimean War. While domestic railway construction continued at a reduced pace, investment in railways abroad, and particularly in North America, provided an outlet for idle capital and stimulated an unprecedented boom in world trade based, as far as Britain was concerned, on the growth in exports of coal, iron, machinery, and railway equipment, and on the growth in imports of food and raw materials. The railways, in turn, opened up new areas as markets for manufactured goods and as sources of supply of food and raw materials, stimulating the growth of shipbuilding and an export boom that sustained the traditional export industries that opened up new opportunities. Although railway products provided a relatively small proportion of the increases in production and trade, there is no doubt that the railways played the pivotal role in breaking through the barriers of overproduction that had regularly halted the traditional export industries in their tracks by opening up export markets, the growth of which closely followed the construction of railways. The growth of international trade and investment stimulated the growth of British shipping and of the financial institutions that provided the credit, finance, insurance, and means of payment that increasingly made London the financial center of the world. The boom in the early 1850s associated with foreign railway investment in the Crimean War eventually broke in Europe in 1856 and America in 1857, where bank failures spread rapidly to Britain and led to a run on the Bank of England, which required the suspension of the Bank Act to allow the reserves of the issue department to support the banking department. The revival of trade and investment at the end of the 1850s initiated the recovery. Although the American Civil War initially created financial difficulties and led to an acute shortage of cotton, the financial problems were soon overcome, and with the fall in interest rates, a new speculative investment boom was underway. This time, the crash in 1866 could not be blamed on the unsound practices of foreign bankers, for it was one of the greatest of the London discount houses, Overend, Gurney & Co., that failed. The Bank of England again survived the subsequent run by the skin of its teeth, thanks to the now traditional Treasury letter offering indemnity against breaking the Bank Act. Although the willingness of the bank to lend freely prevented the crisis from bringing down the banking system, high rates of interest delayed recovery and created difficulties for commerce and industry, and particularly for shipbuilding, before recovery eventually got underway, with the greatest of all the Victorian booms that lasted from 1869 to 1873. The mid-Victorian boom was attributed by the bourgeoisie to the liberalization of trade within a framework of sound money and finance. Growing prosperity in industry and agriculture seemed to extend to all classes of the population, and appeared as the perfect vindication of bourgeois faith in the simple truths of political economy, and in the virtues of thrift, frugality, and self-improvement. However, the liberalization of trade played a relatively minor role in the boom. It was not the freeing of market forces that had stimulated the boom, but the massive investment in the railways. Moreover, the surge of railway investment was not stimulated by the pressure of market forces, but by the successive waves of speculative mania that led to the construction of railways with little regard to any demand for improved methods of transport. Railway promotions were stimulated by the prospect of speculative gains for the promoters and were eagerly subscribed to by investors. In the 1840s, domestic railway shares were only partly paid up, offering the prospect of substantial gains for a small investment, while foreign railway promotions were normally guaranteed by governments. In either case, there was little need for the promoter or the investor to ask too much about the future profitability of the undertaking. Moreover, domestic railway companies were incorporated by parliamentary acts, while the majority of foreign promotions were sponsored by national or local governments, so that political, and particularly in the case of Indian railways, military considerations played a more important part than economic factors in determining the pace and location of railway construction, as every town sought to secure its place on the railway map. While there was considerable scope for fraud and corruption, the railways booms had more to do with hidden backhander than the hidden hand of the market. The result was that far more railways were projected than were ever built, and far more railways were built than ever could be justified economically. The successive waves of speculative mania were consequently followed by successive crashes as railway projects failed to realize the anticipated profits and as foreign governments found themselves unable or unwilling to honor their guarantees. The cyclical fluctuations in railway investment as speculative mania gave way to default and crash communicated themselves to other branches of trade and industry and reverberated through the financial system on an increasingly international scale. Moreover, such cyclical patterns of overinvestment and crisis were not confined to railway construction, but arose independently in other branches of production and in the building industry, whether on the basis of expected increases in demand, the introduction of new technology, or the cheapness of finance. Although there was a marked cyclical pattern overall, the impact of periods of depression and recovery on different sectors and different countries was uneven. The cyclical pattern of growth did not lead to any questioning of the principles of political economy, although each crash led to widespread bankruptcies, excess capacity, and unemployment. The physical investments largely remained in place, while the losses were borne by merchants and financiers. Excessive railway investment led to bankruptcy for railway companies and losses for investors, but the railways remained, reducing transport costs even if they could only be operated profitably by writing off the initial fixed investment. Excessive investment in mining and in the iron and shipbuilding industries created bankruptcy, excess capacity, and unemployment in those industries, but it also created cheap coal, iron, and ships to reduce the cost of industries using those resources. Thus, each crash was rapidly followed by a revival in which prosperity reached new heights. The cyclical pattern of growth was still seen as being essentially financial in origin, arising from human failings that underlay the persistence of unsound banking practices and were expressed in psychological waves of optimism and pessimism that continued to fuel speculation and overinvestment in periods of boom. The remedy was therefore seen to lie in the development of ever more sophisticated methods of controlling the expansion of credit, although every extension of control simply led credit expansion to find new channels as soon as the prospects of profit re-emerged in the boom. The experience of the crisis of 1847 led the Bank of England to pursue more conservative banking policies, but this did not prevent the new joint stock banks feeding chains of speculative credit in the 1850s as they competed for ever more dubious business. The bank amalgamations from the 1870s reduced competition for domestic business, and so led to the adoption of more conservative banking policies by the joint stock banks in their domestic lending. However, this did not prevent the banks from feeding speculative ventures overseas. For the bourgeoisie, the blemishes on the face of capitalism in the mid-Victorian boom were its birthmarks that would fade with maturity. The persistence of poverty was a residue of the mentality of feudal dependence that continued to afflict the working class. Cyclical fluctuations were a residue of the speculative impulses of antediluvian forms of capitalism. Wars and insurrections, the result of old autocracies' attempt to hang on to their power. However, these birthmarks were not fading, but were becoming cancerous growths as they assumed new forms. Poverty was no longer the poverty of displaced petty producers, but the pauperism of the working class. Successive crises grew increasingly severe and were less the result of financial indiscretions than of the emergence of overproduction on an increasing scale. Class struggle was less directed against the privilege and corruption of the old order and more directed at capital and its state. Wars were less geopolitical conflicts and becoming more an extension of capitalist competition. Unless these forces could be contained, the prospect was of the growing polarization of society, intensifying crises, sharpening class struggles, and more destructive wars. For Marx, these tendencies were inherent in the capitalist mode of production and would lead inevitably to its demise.